Good morning, and welcome to St. Paul's Roaming Sanctuary on this Sunday morning. Now, I have to be honest, we actually haven't really strayed that far. In fact, we're in the backyard of the parsonage. But I do promise that we'll venture out, and I also have a special guest preacher for you this morning. But before we do all that, let us gather this morning in a moment of prayer. I happen to be standing, a prayer by Mary Oliver. I don't know where prayers go or what they do. Do cats pray while they sleep, half asleep in the sun? Does the opossum pray as it crosses the street? The sunflowers? The old black oak growing older every year? I know I could walk through the world, along the shore or under the trees, with my mind filled with things of little importance, in full self-attendance. A condition I can't really call being alive. Is a prayer a gift or a petition, or does it matter? The sunflowers blaze. Maybe that's their way. Maybe the cats are sound asleep. Maybe not. While I was thinking this, I happened to be standing just outside my door with my notebook open, which is the way I begin every morning. Then a wren in the privet began to sing. He was positively drenched in enthusiasm. I don't know why. And yet, why not? I wouldn't persuade you from whatever you believe or whatever you don't. That's your business. But I thought of the wren singing. What should this be if it isn't a prayer? So I just listened, my pen in the air. This week, we have a special guest preacher, my friend Matthew, who has had one of the most unusual and interesting life journeys of anyone I know. For as long as I've known Matthew, Matthew has been homeless, and for 10 of those years, he actually lived on the streets of Boston. Throughout the 15 years that Kathy, Eden, and I lived in New Hampshire, at our invitation, Matthew became a frequent visitor to our home, often spending a week or two at a time with us. During those visits, Matthew would often convince us to watch a classic old black and white movie on Netflix or Amazon. A few years ago, Matthew convinced Eden, when she was 13 or 14 at the time, to watch the classic film 12 Angry Men, starring Henry Fonda. Well, little did any of us know then that the drama club at BFA would select 12 Angry Men as this year's high school play, and that Eden would be in one of the parts. So on March 11th, Matthew took a Greyhound bus from Boston to St. Albans for a quick 3-day visit to see Eden perform in this play. Then the Ides of March came, and well, we all know what happened. So we told Matthew that he'd be less at risk of catching the virus if he'd stay here with us in St. Albans. And so he's been here with us since then. I invited Matthew to write something up to read to us in this Sunday morning's video.
In 1995, I experienced what ended up proving to be an unstoppable downward spiral, one that resulted in my being evicted from the apartment in Boston that I had been living in for over 15 years. In the time leading up to the eviction, I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. In one sense, I felt like I'd been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute, and I was free falling through the sky to the ground below. In another sense, I felt like I'd been thrown overboard from a boat in the middle of an ocean without even so much as a life preserver to help keep me afloat. And if those kinds of nightmares aren't disturbing enough, try to imagine the feeling of waking up only to realize that what had caused those nightmares in the first place had actually happened, that you were indeed evicted, and that you now were indeed homeless, with nowhere to go at the end of a long day to be able to use a restroom to get cleaned up and to get enough rest and sleep. Well, for me, this was a life-changing experience. It felt like the end of the world to me, as I thought there'd be no way I'd be able to survive something so awful as being homeless. However, soon after I had hit the streets, I saw something that started to turn everything around for me. I had gone to the main office of the Massachusetts Coalition for the Homeless in Boston to get some basic information about where a homeless person could go to get some meals at soup kitchens, for instance. As I was getting ready to leave, I saw a poster on a bulletin board in the hallway. The poster showed a close-up of the face of Jesus from an old black and white lithographic print with the words, "How can you worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" After I read that, I took a step back. I stared at the poster for a while, and I remember thinking, what's this? Jesus was homeless? I've never heard that before. When I was growing up, going to church every Sunday, I was always taught that Jesus was an itinerant preacher. Well, while there is certainly truth to those words, I eventually came to realize that it was a bit of a euphemism. For Jesus was indeed homeless. Jesus was in need of refuge and shelter at various times throughout his life. And so, all of a sudden, this nightmarish experience of being homeless was transformed for me by the realization that Jesus, too, had experienced being homeless and being in need of refuge and shelter himself. Don't get me wrong, homelessness is still an injustice. It's still an outrageous and unacceptable condition of human suffering and misery that no human being should ever have to experience. Certainly not here in the United States, a nation that has as many resources as we have. Well, 2.5 years later, after I'd been miraculously surviving the various trials and tribulations of living out on the streets of Boston, I attended Boston's annual Thanksgiving Day turkey dinner for homeless people at the Massachusetts State House, an event they called the Harvest of Shame. At that dinner, one of the volunteers serving the meal was a young 28-year-old student from Andover Newton Theological School named Preston Fuller. And that's how Preston and I first met, a little more than 20 years ago. Ever since, I have often thought that, well, to borrow one of the best closing lines from any film in history, namely Casablanca, that was the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Preston started inviting me to speak and show my artwork at the theological school, as well as at his church, where he served as youth minister. He even invited me to house sit for him at his apartment at the seminary, whenever he and his wife Kathy went away during the Christmas holiday break. Well, eventually, I started to meet more and more theological school students, where that same kind of pattern proved that it could be repeated again and again. It was like I had discovered a formula that worked anywhere and at any time, in churches of all kinds, including at chapels and campus ministry departments, at colleges and universities. In short, it was wonderfully ecumenical. After a few years, I started getting invited outside of Massachusetts, to Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and eventually I made it all the way across the country, from Boston to San Francisco. So now, after surviving almost 10 long years of homelessness on the streets of Boston, I haven't had to sleep out on the streets or in a homeless shelter for more than 15 years. And whenever I'm back in the Boston area, I house sit and take care of the pets of various friends of mine, most of whom are former theological school students who have since graduated and become ordained priests, ministers, church pastors, youth ministers, even university chaplains. Eventually, Preston started telling people, "My friend Matthew used to be homeless, but not anymore. He's become an itinerant preacher." So now, Wherever I go in this world, wherever I get invited to speak, my message is always the same, and that is, the church, any house of worship, is not the pastor's house. It's not the church council's house. It's not the bishop's house. The truth of the matter is, the church is God's house. It's Jesus' house. It's the house of the Lord here on earth today. And remember, during Jesus' lifetime, when he walked among us here on earth, Jesus had been rendered homeless. He experienced being in need of refuge and shelter at various times throughout his life. And Jesus once said, "Whatever you do to the least of my brothers and sisters, you do to me." Therefore, we're not supposed to neglect to welcome in, nor to show hospitality to, nor to give refuge and shelter to the stranger in our midst, nor to the transient wanderer, nor to the poor and the oppressed, nor to the needy and the vulnerable, nor to the marginalized and the immigrant, nor to the outcast and the homeless. Churches, therefore, are not supposed to be closed nor locked up so much of the time as virtually all churches are today. They're supposed to be open to all, and all without exception. And so now, during this serious coronavirus pandemic, when government officials are calling people to shelter at home, who is remembering those who have no home into which they can take shelter? Who is remembering the homeless poor? I'm not expecting any changes such as these to happen anytime soon, but perhaps someday, sometime after this pandemic has been effectively overcome, churches will be more welcoming and hospitable to those who have been rendered homeless and poor, as Jesus had been.
For in my hour of darkness I may be seeking the joy of love unspoken. O Lord, be thou near to me, and the holy voices sing hallelujah. Ever will thy reign be, as I wander through this life. O Lord, be thou near to me. Though in this burden of my making, yet in the shadow still a light I see. Maker whose love is not forsaken. O Lord, be thou near to me, and the holy voices sing hallelujah. Ever will thy reign be, as I wander through this life. O Lord, be thou near to me.
you, Matthew. Those were great words. Matthew once told me that an interesting thing about homeless people is they're fantastic storytellers. He thinks that maybe that's a survival instinct, and maybe one reason Jesus himself was such a great storyteller is he experienced homelessness as well. If you would like Matthew to come to a place that you know of, maybe a civic organization or a classroom, and share his story, just let me know. We would love to have Matthew visit you. Well, this is our closing this morning, and I have a special surprise. On June 14th, we are going to have a drive-in theater on Amy and Bill Roberts' property. So there'll be more information about that coming out very soon. Well, until next week, remember to go forth, do no harm, do all the good you can, and stay in love with God. Peace be upon you.